Alrighty, in today's video, I'm going to be covering the best decks of the metagame right now, but it's not going to be just the best decks. I'm going to talk about a lot of decks and a lot of different strategies and kind of how you need to start thinking about the meta as a whole and what you can do to start targeting some of the most popular, most played, most powerful strategies. Before we get going, please subscribe to the channel. Getting so close to 4K subs would be awesome to hit it. Additionally, if you're looking for some more content from me, some deck lists and things like that, please do check out the Patreon. All right, so let's kind of break down what I'll be covering. So it's going to be these bullet points here are not going to be happening in any specific order necessarily, but it's going to be a meta review in general. I'll be covering first the top 4 decks in my opinion and how they play and how to play against them. We'll be doing a deep dive on that. It's not going to be a deck list review. I will have some sample lists up there, but I'm not going to be covering card choices and tech like that. I'll also then be talking about kind of that next tier of decks. This is a much wider range of things that are played and kind of where their shortcomings are and what kind of strategies they aim to target. So we'll talk a little bit about breakthrough candidates and things like that. I want to preface this by saying this is based on my personal experience and personal opinion, right? I'm not going to be bringing out matchup statistics from previous tournaments. I'm going to talk to you about my own testing data and how I view the matchups between these decks and different archetypes, what I think is favored into other things based on kind of how I see them perform in my internal testing. I think you see a lot of different opinions about different archetypes in general. Like deck A is favored into deck B, but someone thinks deck B is favored into deck A. Maybe one data point from some tournament suggests that one of those two is correct, but it doesn't always line up with my own personal experience or someone else's personal experience. And all I can do is try to preface this by saying this will be based on data from me, based on like how things do into the people I play against, who I think are very good players. I think I, for the most part, know what I'm doing when I'm playing. So that's how when I do like a deep dive like this, it's not just going to be based on this deck beat this deck in some tournament, so this deck is favored, right? Like I could very much see that if once people get more practice with certain strategies, matchups tend to sometimes flip on their head and something gets unlocked. So that's let's couch this in that. It's going to be a lot about my personal experience and my personal opinions. All right. So the meta breakdown as a whole, what I call the gauntlet. Now, this is something I actually feature on my Patreon. It's a whole section, which is like a gauntlet. It includes updated lists of high performing decks, and I curate it based on what I feel is the most appropriate stuff to recommend other people test into. And right now it includes 4 decks, and the lists, we'll see them in a moment, but in like tier A of this gauntlet, I have Jango Tarkintown and Bossk Blue. I do think these are the 2 most well-rounded strategies right now. And then below that, I have Han Yellow and Sabine ECL as kind of like the next step. I'll talk about each of these decks individually in a little bit. And then we've got the next tier, and this is a lot of stuff. I'm gonna name a few of them, but there's a lot of things here. There's like Cad Bane Tarkintown, right? There's Quinlan of any variety, often Tarkintown as well, sometimes ECL, sometimes even blue. So these are like yellow green or yellow red or like mid-rangey hero decks. A lot of the time it kind of leaks into the Anakin stuff as well. Now these decks don't play the same, but they are generally just like hero mid-range, right? Quinlan, Anakin, Rey, Luke, these are all in that bucket of like mid-rangey decks. Cad Bane is also kind of a mid-rangey deck. It's a unit-based control strategy. In reality, it's not an aggro strategy. And there's a lot more on this list, of course, but these are some decks that have certainly been more popular, especially recently. We saw Cad Bane had a pretty good weekend in the UK. Anakin was actually the most represented leader in the UK tournament recently. Rey and Luke not yet have been super popular, but blue-green or mono-blue or blue-red, as well as with like Anakin, are popular strategies. And then in this other bucket, we have like the unit control decks. These are not hard control decks like Bossk Blue. This usually is like Kira Krennic, Palpatine. So like Kira Krennic almost always just is like a blue-green mid-range control strategy. And then Palpatine with a lot of different colors, often blue, of course, mono-green sometimes, yellow even, usually not red. But these are the other decks. They all have different issues with some of the top decks that we just talked about. So we'll get into that a little later. So the first deck I'm going to cover is Jango Tarkintown, which in my opinion right now is the de facto #1 deck. I think it's the deck you most need to kind of make sure you have a strategy into. So the way this deck wins is not just through pure aggression. It is an aggro deck, but it can play long into games on the back of Jango's ability. That exhaust ability that a lot of its units provide means that decks that would normally have been able to turn the corner against a strategy like this struggle much more because their biggest units often can't even attack, right? Suppose you're a deck that is trying to control the Jango early and then needs to turn the corner with large units. Well, you're usually getting pressure. So the first thing decks like this need to usually do is answer threats before they can push damage. But the problem here is a lot of the threats you end up answering, namely something like P38 or Ruthless Raider, when they die, they then exhaust your largest unit. So you end up in this weird situation where by answering their threats, you kind of let them answer your threats. And Jango Tarkintown can go very long because it's able to stall out this way and not get damage pushed onto its base while also pushing damage onto your base. It has a lot of reach. It has Ruthless Raiders. It has Daring Raids. It has a lot of pumps, right? It does a very good job of just like drawing its bombs because Triple Dark Raid, right, is essentially tutoring up powerful cards that then end up in your hand afterwards. It tends to have answers to a lot of mid-rangey units, whether it's with like Cad Bane or just the fact that they can exhaust those units out, right? So Jango is very powerful into a lot of the decks that we saw in that second tier. Something like Cad Tarkintown, in my opinion, has a major issue with this deck. And I know it's not something that we saw play out in the UK. Cad Bane actually had a positive win rate into Jango Tarkintown, but I think once a Jango player identifies how they're supposed to fight into these unit mid-range decks, that matchup very much flips on into Jango's favor. Same with like the Quinlan decks and a lot of these mid-rangey hero decks, with the exception of some of the mono blue or blue green stuff, which we'll talk about. So how do you target this deck? Well, I think Bossk Blue, especially in a main boarded configuration, something like we can see on the list here. This was from Star City Game, the first place deck that John Tata had a couple weeks ago. This deck will struggle in its main deck configuration into Bossk. Bossk is able to mitigate enough damage for long enough and then drop things like Snoke, which can lock out a deck like this quite easily, especially when they don't have access to sideboard stuff. Now, I think you can make this matchup closer for you as the Jango player by including things that get rid of the bounties, like Disabling Fangfighter or any like self-bounce stuff. Potentially some hand hate with like Bazine. I think Cad Bane is actually pretty good because it can remove a Snoke temporarily, which then allows you to push some damage. Another very powerful card in this strategy into Bossk is Wolf. Wolf has not always been a very powerful sideboard card, but into a deck that telegraphs its healing with bounties, Wolf becomes much more powerful. So Jango can fix the matchup a bit, but I do think he is behind in the Bossk matchup. But he eats up a lot of the mid-rangey decks, especially the ones that are not like Hero Blue or Hero Blue Green. And then like the Quinlan Tarkintown, the Cad Tarkintown, even like the Anakin stuff, I think Jango is ahead there. Jango has, I don't know, like between him and Sabine, like I err towards Jango being slightly ahead there, but I think that one is pretty close because Sabine does present ways to go wide enough to not always get exhausted down, and also the Wrecker interaction with the Jango is quite powerful, being able to one-shot Jango, which then means that entire turn, Jango's ability is offline, allows Sabine to push a lot of damage that turn often, which, you know, when you are Sabine and you've already pushed a bunch of damage, can be very powerful. So Jango, it does some really unfair things. I'm spending a lot of time on this deck. It'll probably be the one I spend the most time on, but like it also has stuff like Lurking Tie, which can just coincidentally steal games from people. It forces basically any deck that's running blue to play a lot of perilous positions, and potentially even more than just perilous positions, stuff like make an opening, or if you're playing mono blue, equalize, just to make sure that they can not like get a game stolen from this Lurking Tie. So this deck is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly resilient. It doesn't, like I said earlier, it can go long. Like you can win on turn 9, turn 10 with this deck because you just don't. While you can get your threats answered, you can also prevent your opponent from killing you. And eventually you can draw into enough reach, enough units, go wide enough. The deck itself doesn't need to resource too heavily, sometimes even stopping at 6 or 7, which means that it's against a lot of strategies that need to resource deeper. You're kind of you're drawing 2 a turn and they're drawing 1 a turn because they have to resource. So deck's very good, and it's the first thing I recommend to like kind of get a handle on when you're testing. And the other one in that top bucket was Bossk Blue. So this is a hard control deck. It's not everyone's favorite thing to play. These games can go very, very long sometimes, especially like mirrors. You're often playing a best of 1 when you're playing a mirror. And then the other issue sometimes that a deck like this could present is that once more people are playing it, you have to start dedicating a lot more slots to the mirror and to these grindy games, especially in the main board, because if you lose game 1, you might never have an opportunity to play game 2 or game 3. So this is Thork's list that he won in the UK with, which was not really designed to win mirrors, and I don't think he had to play any. He did play 2 Palpatines, which were also very grindy games. But I think now that this deck is going to be more popular, in part because he won a giant tournament with it, we may need to start evolving it to have a little more anti-mirror stuff. So that thing might look like Bounty Hunter Crew, more copies of Restock, Hand Hate like Spark of Rebellion or Bazine, right? So that starts eating percentages from other matchups. But in general, this deck, like I said, pretty favorable into Jango. It has a lot of the ways to kill Lurking Tie. It has a ton of healing. It has a ton of removal. It can usually just survive long enough to drop a Snoke and an Avenger and just like be okay. This deck is much more resilient at reaching this endgame stage with enough life, something that has not been easy for the blue-green, like softer control decks like Kira and Krennic to do into Jango. They struggle much more into Jango because they don't have nearly as much resiliency and nearly as much healing. Into Sabine, I'd say the matchup is actually like pretty even, which is great for a hard control deck that it is not folding to a hard aggro deck. Where I think this deck really struggles is the mono yellow Han. I think mono yellow Han eats this deck once the yellow Han player knows what he's doing and has identified the right lines. This matchup becomes an absolute nightmare for Bossk. And it's not always, this is another thing I'll say, like it's about like identifying like what is favored and not. This is my experience, and I know a lot of people have actually talked to me and said kind of the other way around sometimes, where like they actually struggled as Han into Bossk, and that can be an experience that you have, and it's certainly a real experience. And all I can speak of is from my own personal testing, especially once a Han has identified mostly the following line, which is you're not really an aggro deck into Bossk. You are just a hand destruction deck. You just will start bouncing your own Bodhies with Waylay and Cunning. You'll block things with Kira. You'll play Spark of Rebellion. You actually are cool with this matchup going very, very long. You can grind a boss to dust. Your main goal is to not let them draw extra cards with things like Deathmark, which is hard for them to resolve with all your bounce. You can self-bounce things to remove that Deathmark. You try to remove their Pershings if they play it, and then If you hate at their hand enough, you can usually set up a DJ as well and just keep the Bossk deck from escalating and generating card advantages, what the Bossk player needs to do. And then eventually you just grind them out, death by 1,000 cuts. So that is how I would approach like the Han into this. And it is one of the difficult matchups for a Bossk blue once the Han kind of identifies that line. So as far as like into that next tier of matchups, I think Bossk certainly eats up a lot of those mid-range decks that we talked about, probably most of them. It might not have as clean of a matchup into something like Palpatine, or especially decks that play Relentless. Now, Relentless is one of the strongest cards, not one Relentless, but usually strategies that green villains will employ will be multiple Relentless with multiple ways to buy back Relentless, and eventually you can lock out a hard control deck with that card, and it is one of the more difficult things for Bossk to maneuver. All right, Han Yellow. So this is the first of the kind of like next tier of this gauntlet, and Han and Sabine both have different issues. They're kind of reverse issues. So Han Yellow, I think of this deck as a very good top cut deck. If you look at the other 3 decks here on this list, Han is both favored into, in my opinion, into the Bossk blue deck and into the Sabine ECL deck, and pretty even into the Jango deck. And that is a fantastic place to be for a deck. But where the issue is sometimes for the Han deck is that things like Cad Bane or Quinlan Tarkintown, some of these other like mid-rangey unit control decks can pose some problems for it. It's not always clean there. Now it does usually beat up on like the like bigger mid-rangey decks. Something like blue-green hero, for instance, can definitely struggle into a Han deck because the DJ stuff is more difficult for them to maneuver. Their leaders come out a little late sometimes, but the Tarkintown decks, especially the ones that are controlling the ground game like Cad and Quinlan, can be quite difficult for a Han Yellow to deal with. And like the blue-green villainy decks, you'll get mixed opinions on that matchup. I think it's pretty even overall, but yeah, so I think Han is also like, it's a challenging deck to kind of register because it employs a very different strategy into a lot of different decks. Like I said with the Bossk blue, for instance, you would think this deck is just like, I need to aggro Bossk blue. I don't want this game to go long, but it might take a little while to actually figure out that that's not really how that matchup is supposed to be played, and that Han is actually kind of a control deck into Bossk blue. And in different matchups, Han changes dramatically how it plays. So it's a kind of thing that you need to be very keenly aware of the meta and like what different decks you need to prepare for, because your strategy can change pretty wildly between them. But it is a very good, like I said, top cut deck. It has solid matchups across the board to the gauntlet decks. So it's why I include it on the top of this list. It has never seemed to be a very highly represented deck. I'm not exactly sure why. I'm never one to say that like one deck is harder to play than another. I think they're all hard or easy to play, whichever one you want to pick. All of them, mostly. I don't know if that's a valid argument to say why people don't play this deck. I can't tell you why. It usually only hovers around 5 to 10% of a field, but it doesn't always do well. And I think personally it is a deck that would be good at top tables in an event if you can get there. And then the last in this like gauntlet is Sabine ECL. This deck is kind of evergreen. This deck doesn't really need any cards from set 3. The one listed here is the one that finished 8-0 in the UK event. It did play one set 3 card in Yularen. I probably wouldn't even be playing Yularen. I would just be playing set 2 Sabine. But this deck does some very linearly powerful things. Poe and Wrecker with ECL are nuts. They will continue to be gut checks on this format. Now, I said earlier that I felt like the Han and Sabine were kind of on opposite ends of like this tier 2. And what I mean by that is I actually think Sabine has a little bit of an issue with the rest of the gauntlet. I think it's unfavored into the mono yellow Han. I think it's basically even matchups with Jango and Bossk. And that might not be where you want to be with your deck, because you might want to have favorable matchups into some of those top 4 decks. Whereas Sabine does kind of clean up a lot of like other things, and does live in this world of the 50-50. It's not a real statistic. It's just phrase that I'll use to describe a deck that like is never really out of any matchup, and Sabine definitely falls in that range. It's not usually where aggro decks fall. Like a 50-50 deck is usually like a light control deck that just like kind of a reactive deck that like doesn't have any good matchups, doesn't have any bad matchups, but it kind of is the reality of Sabine for the most part. I mean, it does have some good and bad matchups, but into a wide variety of decks, like mid-range decks, and the stuff that we talked about in the gauntlet, like Jango and Bossk, it does live in this like middle area, and it is a very innately powerful deck. It steals games just by the sheer power of some of like the interactions, especially the ECL interaction with Wrecker, and it is still a good choice. But right now, I do feel like with the way the top of the meta has developed, it might not actually be a great top cut choice, as opposed to like the Han deck, which might struggle more in the lower, in the earlier rounds of a tournament. Sabine might end up having a little bit more of a problem in the later rounds of the tournament. All right, the mid-range. So there's not going to be any like samples here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about these decks. So Cad Bane Tarkintown had a very good weekend in the UK, is a popular deck. I think it's a powerful strategy, but I do think it, for instance, has an issue with a few strategies. Number one, Jango Tarkintown. I think it's a very poor matchup for Cad Bane. Lurking TIE Phantom kind of bricks this entire deck, and I know the deck can play space units to interact with it, but it doesn't line up that well once the Jango knows what it's doing. First of all, they also get to Tarkintown one of your plays. They can protect their Lurking TIE with exhausts on your space units and then finish them off. And a Lurking TIE bricks Cad Bane leader entirely, and it's a huge problem because it's a major tenet of what makes the deck powerful. It does well into like other strategies for sure. I think it has a decent Han matchup, has a decent Sabine matchup. It can beat up on mid-range decks, but I do think it struggles with the Jango stuff, and I think it will also struggle mightily with hard control. And that's why it's in this tier, because it's having 2 poor matchups, in my opinion, to 2 of the top gauntlet decks. So are there ways to fix it? A little bit. I mean, you get hand hate in this color if you need it. You can try to skew a little more aggro, but that's difficult. You can find ways to blow up bounties, which I think is necessary for a deck like this, especially into Bossk. But whereas Jango can employ that strategy a little more cleanly, because first of all, it's got triple dark ray to go find upgrade hate, and it can push more damage a little quicker. Cad Bane is a little bit of a slower deck. A lot of what it's doing is aiming to control the board, right? It's basically a control deck. It's like all it's doing is like trying to kill opponents' units on curve, and then like a critical mass of its own units, and then start going face. And that can be an issue into hard control strategies. Quinlan, especially Quinlan Red, a lot of this is true there as well, although I think Quinlan will have a better time into Bossk, because Hero Yellow Red has an absolute critical mass of hand hate. You got Spark of Rebellion. You get to play Force Throw with your Force Leader. You get to play K2. You can play Pillage if you want, especially post board. So you can get under a Bossk. I think as long as you make sure you're able to like not get bountied out, especially like a draw 4 can be absolutely devastating for a deck that's going to try to hand hate, right? So you need to make sure that doesn't happen. But if you can, I think Quinlan can do okay there. But very similarly to Cad Bane, I think you have major issues with the Jango deck, which will be able to just go along with you. A Jango just needs to understand that they're not supposed to play into Tarkintown on the first turn. They're okay just claiming going to turn 2. I think Jango lines into some of the Cad Bane and the Quinlan Tarkintown decks. Once you identify them and find better ways to fight into these like mid-rangey hero control decks or Cad Bane like Tarkintown deck, your Jango matchup will improve dramatically into them. They certainly are not free, right? Like, these decks can beat Jango. I just find them unfavored into Jango once the Jango kind of identifies the correct way to approach these. And like I said, that's avoiding the Tarkintown early, being okay making the game go a little longer because you're able to turn corners really well. You can prevent, and while preventing your opponent, your Quinlan or your Cad Bane opponent, from turning their corner, because your Ruthless Raider exhausts their thing and then also dies and exhausts their thing, and you're just pushing damage while preventing damage at the same time. Anakin was primarily a blue deck in the UK, although it gets played a little bit with yellow as well. Sometimes even green, but it is primarily a blue-red force deck, similar to like the Rey and like the Han Blue of old. It does pack a little bit more of a punch. It closes games out a little quicker, especially against certain decks, because Anakin can hit for absurd amount of damage. But at its core, it's still kind of like this hero-y soft control deck. Aims to like remove units with combat, has big haymakers like Luke. Again, issues with Jango, because as every other deck that I've been talking about that is based on units turning the corner, Jango does a very good job of preventing that corner from ever be turned. But Anakin does get to play blue, and blue is an important color into Jango because you get things like Perilous Position, make an opening, more healing, vigilance if you need it, Space Sentinels like Concord Dawn. So not freebie by any means, but Anakin also kind of has issues with the Bossk stuff. So like a lot of these mid-range decks, the common trend here is that like they get kind of pulled in two directions between Jango and Bossk, and they both become difficult matchups just kind of innately, and it's difficult to kind of gear up for both of them. Rey and Luke, primarily Rey, if you're going to talk red, it's going to be very similar spread to the Anakin stuff. But you know, Rey Red also has more healing and more defensive capabilities than Anakin, so it's able to slow down games a little more than Anakin does. Luke, on the other hand, is a blue-green for the most part, and blue-green does get to play Concord Dawn and Bright Hope, which is a big boon when you're trying to fight into the Jango decks. Those are some of the best Space Sentinels in the game and do help you prolong games long enough to get down to like a Luke Skywalker and start turning the corner. I actually made a guide on a Rey green version that employs a lot of these same strategies, but those decks can really struggle into control decks, and you have to just like either accept that your matchup's going to be awful there, or dedicate an absurd amount of sideboard equity and then still maybe not have a great matchup there. So give and take. That's what a lot of these decks are, is that like when paired into like the Gauntlet decks, and the Rey and Luke can also have problems with the Han deck as well, because they're like slower and their leaders come out at 6. They're much more susceptible to getting DJ'd out of a game. So it's a lot about give and take, like which matchups do you want to target. You can certainly target Jango with these decks. You might start struggling more with Bossk or Han, right? So there's a lot more on this list, and I am going to talk a little bit about like a Rey mono blue deck, which I've been working on. It's actually featured for free on my Patreon right now, and you're going to see a deck list of it in a little bit. But it's kind of like when I'm talking about other considerations or ways to kind of break through into the meta, you might get an idea of like my thought process and how I try to approach like breaking into this top tier and or like countering some of this top tier. So yeah, it's not in like overall like the notes here. Jango Tarkintown, Bossk blue. A lot of these decks have issues with both and or one of those. And then on top of that, you have to start accounting for Sabine and Han yellow. And while I do think a lot of these decks can handle Sabine, decks like Rey and Luke have a much bigger issue with something like Han. But like the Tarkintown decks, Cad Bane and Quinlan, can have decent Sabine matchups, which is great. And Anakin, those matchups can be toss-ups, and Anakin can certainly close out a game against Sabine for sure. These decks are fair but adaptable, right? They are mid-range decks, which means they don't really have a core. They're not like, maybe that's the wrong phrase. They don't have a lot of like, they're not locked into anything very specific. They are kind of reactive by nature, and they can be adapted. And then lastly, mono blue, which we'll talk about a little later, might have some potential to do some cool stuff into this metagame. All right, and then the unit control, which was like the other part of the second tier stuff. This is mostly like blue-green villain or Palpatine yellow. These are controlling decks that, when you talk about like Kira and Krennic, those are decks that try to live in like the middle area. They try to have like no unfavored matchups, but like also don't really have favored matchups. The issue I've identified with them is similar to a lot of these unit-based decks, is that they have problems with Jango. They even play a lot of the necessary removal and interaction. They get Snoke, but they have a hard time closing games out because they end up in situations where they've taken a decent amount of damage, and then they have to make decisions. Okay, do I push damage myself or do I work on damage prevention? But damage prevention is always a problem when their units end up getting exhausted and don't get to actually push, right? And the absolute nightmare card for blue-green villain is Ruthless Raider. It is a beating for these decks, and Jango always plays Ruthless Raider, and a lot of them, they get to triple dark raid for them. They find them all the time. It's very hard to play a game where you're beating like 3 Ruthless Raiders. Even 2 sometimes is too many. And that, right now, I'm working more on Kira. I still think she's overall better positioned between the Kira and Krennic stuff. But like really revisiting the deck as a whole, remember, these are reactive decks. Can't just look at what they looked like last set and be like, I'm building on that. You kind of sometimes need to like pull back and just be like, this is a completely new meta. I need new cards to target it. And that's what I'm working on right now with Kira and Krennic, is different ways to fight Jango. Is it possible? Are you giving up too much in that matchup and then end up having issues elsewhere, right? You are still a relentless deck with these two, and a lot of this applies to the blue-green Palpatine as well. It's still a blue-green villain, whereas Palpatine is much more of a spread deck. Like I mentioned earlier, he will have a worse matchup into like Sabine, but better matchups into like the mid-range stuff, whereas Kira and Krennic will live more in that middle area. So the goal here for them, let's see if we can get that Jango matchup back to even. What do we need to include in that deck? Devastating Gunship is a new card that's very good. Perilous Position, do we even need to start including Make an Opening main, or is it okay just having extra copies of like Ways to Kill Lurking Tie in the sideboard? Traitorous is a pretty good card into the Jango decks. So there is room to maneuver here and make that matchup better. But once it's better, we need to go back to the other matchups and see, hey, have we lost too much in these other places? And now it's just, are we not really a good middle deck anymore? And then Palpatine, it's a bigger control deck. It's a deck that can smash a bunch of things. It does have fair, like all of these decks have fair matchups into hard control, especially if they start dedicating more space for things like Relentless. I think post board, the green villain deck can certainly have a good matchup. The issue here is that it's sometimes difficult to play 3 games, so you really need to be careful with that game 1 and identify if you have a chance early on, and don't be afraid to concede. I see this all the time, people playing for way too long into games that they shouldn't be playing anymore. Decks like this, blue-green villain decks that can make good matchups into hard control, especially post-board, need to know when to call it quits so that they can play more games. And I think the hard control deck players also need, like the Boss Blue also needs to understand when they should be conceding, especially like a game 2 where like, okay, they won game 1 and they're going to lose game 2, but are they cool losing game 2 at 48 minutes and never playing game 3, or can they just leave 15-20 minutes on the clock to play a game 3? And both people need to kind of like be aware of this. It's why a lot of people don't want to opt into these kinds of strategies, which I completely understand. So yeah, in synopsis here, Jango Tarkintown remains an issue for Kira and Krennic, in my opinion, but potentially not unfixable, something I'm working on a lot. Relentless is a good card in this metagame into hard control. It's probably the best card into the boss stuff. These decks, Kira and Krennic can fight into Sabine, they can fight into Han. Palpatine, bad Sabine matchup. The Palpatine stuff, no matter what color you're going to work with it, blue, yellow, green, it is not here to beat Sabine. It's here to kind of lose a lot of points in that matchup compared to a lot of decks, but have better matchups into some other stuff. And Palpatine's actually got some interesting stuff to do against Jango, because Kira and Krennic are actually not super impactful in that matchup, whereas Palpatine being able to kind of potentially steal something like a Ruthless Raider and be a much more dominating presence on the board and help you close out games can be important into Jango. If you can ramp a bunch and then just keep a Ruthless Raider at bay, Palpatine can have decent matchups there. All right, I promised a little talk about mono blue. So this is an idea, right? This is not go out and crush everything with it right now. This is featured on my Patreon. Live updates will go through there as well. But the idea here is that we're looking first at Jango. That's kind of my first stop when I'm trying to brew something, is Jango. And between Perilous Position and Equalize, which I think is a fantastic card right now, you've got like their early space stuff covered pretty well. You also get to play Concord Dawn, which is fantastic. You get Restored Arc. Like, you're able to really keep their space from like overwhelming you early. The deck has a ton of built-in healing. Vigilance for 4 is an absolutely amazing power card. You are able to block damage on the ground as well if needed. Like, Jango is often representing 3 to 6 damage, but he might not in this deck. And then on top of that, you get to go to Lukes and Redemptions. And once you start getting multiple restore units on the ground, and that usually means like Rey and Luke, they can't exhaust them both anymore, and you can start generating pressure while healing. So this deck can compete pretty well. And you say, like, why not pair it with another color? Well, we're not playing that much double blue, but Vigilance for 4 is a game changer, and Equalize, I have been very impressed with this card. Now, I don't think it's better than Perilous Position, but I think having both is pretty awesome. On top of that, Queel is basically a mono blue card and is another very good power card to have in the deck like this. So where do we go from here? This is still a mono blue deck, so it's got a lot of healing. It's not free wins into Sabine, but it certainly has decent game into Sabine. And on top of that, we have to start looking at Bossk. So normally Bossk eats up mid-range strategies, and Ray Blue is basically a mid-range deck. But here's my theory, and it's not fully vetted yet. It's something I'm working on, but you can actually just be the better mill deck potentially against Bossk. You get to play Vigilance, and it costs 4. Their Vigilance costs 6, right? And you get to play things like Satine. And there is one in the main deck here and one in the sideboard. Now, you don't expect her to live very long, but sometimes it might even be enough if you get one activation off of one unit with her, right? Milling is just a game of critical mass, and if you're ahead in that battle, excellent. I put a restock in this main deck because you're going to need that for the loops. There's a second one in the sideboard, as well as Spark of Rebellions, which are better in a hero deck, even when you're paying 4, than they would be in a boss deck. If the Bosks often play something like Bounty Hunter Crew for 8 to try to buy back some of this stuff, and you're getting these sparks for 4. This deck has enough removal to beat the few threats that Bossk presents, right? They have a few Avengers, which are mainly their win condition against you. They have Snoke, sometimes Palpatines, but those are not nearly as devastating for you, especially when you have Lukes in your deck that can one-shot those. So you save your removal for their Avengers, and you don't worry so much about the rest of the stuff. They're going to have obvious answers to everything you're doing, but you actually have answers to everything they're doing as well, and you can just be a mill deck too. And we're playing the restock here in the main deck because, again, like that game 1 is very important into these matchups because you often can't play 3 games. So that's kind of the theory behind this deck. It's aiming to target 3 of the 4 gauntlet decks. I think this matchup will be this deck will be very, very poor into the Han Yellow deck. You don't really have great ways to interact with them. You can get DJ'd out. It's not impossible, but it is not a friendly matchup. But while being, in my opinion, pretty favored into Jango and good into Sabine, and then if we can make sure that the Bossk Blue, especially game 1 against Bossk Blue, is decent, all of a sudden maybe we have a newcomer that can push into the meta. And this is just a theory. It might not work out, in which case I'll look at other things, right? I will both practice and hone the gauntlet decks, the top 4, but also I always look to find other things that might be able to break through, and at the very least could be fun and interesting to play, right? It's not always about winning a PQ or something. It's also about finding and exploring other things in the game. All right, so closing thoughts, my current projects, Ray Blue. Another one that I have on my agenda is Emperor Palpatine Blue. I talked about that deck a bit, but I find that, hey, like maybe we just play the spread deck. Maybe we just play the deck that does have a lot of these favorite matchups at the expense of getting kind of beaten up by Sabine or something. Be working on Kira updates, Krennic as well. Just like, can this matchup be made better into Jango? And then from there, will it still be decent into other things? And then something on the back burner a little bit is go wide strategies. It's not a very explored archetype, but you got to think things like Ahsoka, potentially, Wat Tambor, Rex, even like an Anakin Yellow can be built or as like a go wide strategy. Go wide is pretty good into Jango because their exhausting abilities become much less powerful when you do that. As always, if you want live updates to any and all my decks, that'll be on Patreon. So go check it out. There's a few free samples there as well, including that Blu-ray deck that you just saw. All right, that's what I got. Let me know what you think. And until next time, take care.